Hello. Today I would like to talk to you about an issue in sport communication that I believe needs to be addressed more frequently. That issue is the sport media's biased coverage of African American athletes. I'm going to talk to you about how the sport media's coverage of African American athletes differs from their coverage of white athletes, some reasons some suggest why it differs, and why the biased coverage of African American athletes needs to change. Firstly, the how it differs. The coverage itself is lacking. They're covered in very few sports. Typically, the coverage is focused on football, baseball, and basketball for African Americans, despite the fact that they participate in many other sports. Secondly, terms used to describe African American athletes. You can turn on a football game or a baseball game, and you might see an African American athlete make a big play. They might celebrate, get up, pump their fists, what have you, and you won't have to wait long before you hear an announcer say something like, "Oh, look how cocky he is. He has a poor attitude. He should act like he's been there before. He's not a team player." However, when you see a white athlete do the same thing, for instance, say Tim Tebow, Tebow could get a 3-yard run and jump up and pump his fist and praise the Lord and what have you. And those same announcers will say something like, "Look how intense he is. Look how much he cares about his team. He's such a good leader. He's a heady player. He knows if he does that, that'll pump up his team." Some other ways the coverage differs in describing an African American athlete is the comparison to animals. You might see a female African American sprinter have a good time in a 100-meter race, and the announcer says something like, "Oh, she's as fast as a cheetah." But when a white sprinter does the same thing, you would hear them simply lauded for their athleticism and effort. And the reasons for some of these differences, at least some suggest that comparison to an animal, dehumanizes the African American. It keeps them below Caucasians, the dominant race. The lack of coverage marginalizes the African American athlete, suggesting that they're only good at a few things. Thinking they're celebrating in cockiness makes them poor team leaders or poor coaches. These are some reasons some sociologists suggest that some of the differences you hear exist. And finally, to the third topic I mentioned was why it needs to stop. Stereotypes. When you hear these comparisons to animals, or when you hear them referred to as selfish players, it perpetuates a negative stereotype about African Americans, which is unfortunate not just for African Americans interested in pursuing athletics, but in society in general. It is going to cause them to be treated differently in society, not just sports. It creates a bad example when young African Americans, whether they want to pursue an athletic career or not, when they see how their people are being described, they think that's what they're going to do. That's what they're meant to do. That's as good as they are. So it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is something no one needs to happen. So to sum up, I spoke to you about the sport media's biased coverage of African American athletes, some of the differences, terms used to describe them, some reasons that some suggest those differences exist, making the Caucasian race continue to feel superior, and reasons why it needs to change, because a better example needs to be set, and African Americans should be covered the same as any other race. Okay, well, I thank you for your time today, and hopefully the sport media's coverage becomes unbiased and more fair, because it not only will be better for a sport, but society as a whole. Thank you.